Hello? So the audio is working?
Yes.
Thank you to the Boulder community, the Anthropology department. It's nice to see everyone here and be back. And it's nice to see everyone here. I think we need to try again. Hello? Recording in progress. Zoom is not on. People on Zoom, if you can mute yourself. Thank you. All right, I'm going to start. Again, thank you to the Boulder community here for joining me and to discuss this important topic. So this is not working? Yes. Okay. It's especially nice to see the young Tibetan community members here at this talk. It's always exciting to be joined by Tibetan community members who are part of this community. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start. At a recent Denshuk, a long life ritual and prayer ceremony offered by the Tibetan, Mongolian, and Himalayan communities to the 14th Dalai Lama in New York, the Dalai Lama affirmed once again that he would live well past the age of 100. The crowd responded with boisterous applause. Yet, everyone, including the Chinese government, Western academics, Tibetan politicians, and activists, have been in a rush to weigh in on his future succession. While the Chinese government has suggested he reincarnate under their approval and in accordance with their laws, some former and current Tibetan politicians, activists, and writers who belong to the same network of friends in Dharamsala have even begun suggesting that the Dalai Lama choose a Tulku successor while he is alive. Why is everyone in a rush to discuss the Dalai Lama's next reincarnation when the current Dalai Lama is still alive and well? To understand how and why debates about the Dalai Lama's succession have intensified as of in progress requires a detailed consideration of his leadership in exile. My presentation will historicize and contextualize the 14th Dalai Lama's ongoing legacy as a refugee leader who created foundational Tibetan institutions in exile for the thrivance of the Tibetan refugee community and their national cause for freedom. This contextualization will serve as the basis for understanding the Dalai Lama as a formidable leader with immense global influence who has been able to shape and challenge the People's Republic of China's international relations in the world and its government's legitimacy in Tibet. This understanding of the Dalai Lama. Turn it up. The voice is coming from here. Mine's off. Mine is on. I'm gonna go ahead. Yeah, as long as people in Zoom. All right, so this presentation, as a result, is not actually about whether and how the Dalai Lama's future succession will unfold. Instead, I suggest taking a pause and considering what the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan people have said on the matter. As China attempts to create new legal protocols to undermine the Dalai Lama and his authority over his own future, we need to be careful not to make the same mistake. Instead, I invite scholars to become aware of the responsibility that lie ahead on how we choose to shape this discourse, since it will have cascading impacts on the collective lives of the Tibetan people, including the Dalai Lama. To start, let's begin with a simple question. Who is the Dalai Lama? The Dalai Lamas have ruled Tibet for 369 years. The first Dalai Lama, Gendun Drupa, became a disciple of the great Tsongkhapa, founder of the Willock school of Tibetan Buddhism, in 1416. From the first till the fourth, the Dalai Lamas served primarily in their roles as spiritual teacher and advisor. However, in 1642, the fifth Dalai Lama, Lobsang Gyatso, was enthroned as Tibet's official, spiritual, and political sovereign. Under the fifth's directives, he established the Potala Palace in Lhasa as his private residence, from which he presided over the spiritual and political affairs of Tibet through his Ganden Podrong government. From the fifth till the present 14th, Tenzin Gyatso, the Dalai Lamas have ruled Tibet in an unbroken fashion until Communist China's military invasion in 1949. This background serves as a reminder that the Dalai Lamas have served Tibet as its spiritual and political ruler since the 17th century and have made significant contributions in the sovereign developments of Tibet as a nation. But what makes the 14th Dalai Lama special in particular? While his predecessor, the 13th Dalai Lama, Thupten Gyatso, was forced to go into exile multiple times due to imperial invasions by the British in 1904, followed by the Qing in 1910, he was able to return to Tibet eventually in 1913 and proclaim it an independent country. Due to the prolonged occupation of Tibet under current-day communist China, the 14th Dalai Lama is the only Dalai Lama to experience indefinite exile. He is the first and only Dalai Lama to face an imperial invasion in Tibet that has since developed into a full-scale settler colonial occupation in the span of his lifetime. Although China's military invasion ended Tibet's national status as a sovereign country, the 14th Dalai Lama's renewal of his government into the Tibetan government in exile, or the Central Tibetan Administration, mediated a new national beginning for the Tibetan people in exile. As head of state, he led efforts to recreate the social, political, and spiritual worlds of the Tibetan people in exile through the creation of refugee settlements and the founding of institutions in health, education, culture, and religion. His diplomatic and spiritual activities in the international community has also helped the national status and political issue of Tibet stay alive. His lengthy spiritual and political activities as the leader of the Tibetan people have been so influential and impressive that it has impacted China's ability to rule without opposition in Tibet and China's overall international credibility in the world. It is the reason why China dubs him a splittist and sees the 14th Dalai Lama as subversive. This highlights his unique ability to lead his people in exile as a refugee who is capable of upsetting the imperial orders of current-day China. And precisely because of such influential abilities, he has become an important target of China's coercive measures, including attempts to take control of him and his future succession. But this isn't the first time China has attempted to take control of the Dalai Lama. In the past, the Qing dynasty has tried to meddle in the reincarnation process of the Ganden Podrong in the determination of a Dalai Lama. However, the Qing dynasty and its imperial system was brought to its end in 1911 by a Chinese nationalist revolution that began a new republic. However, that rule was short-lived when they were defeated by the Chinese communists in 1949. The current government in Beijing came into power after disavowing China's imperial and nationalist legacies of the past in order to begin an atheist new republic. This government is now reclaiming imperial dynasties of China's past, including the Qing. Yet this government has none of the lineage nor hereditary ties to these monarchical dynasties of the past. This is why I find the current atheist government's claim over the religious reincarnation process of the future Dalai Lama to be illegitimate, because it was Chinese modernists who killed the last imperial dynasty of China. For this and other reasons, the current communist government of China has no claim over the determination process of the future Dalai Lama. The present 14th Dalai Lama, however, does have authority. In fact, he is the only legitimate authority over his own future. I will focus on this fact as the basis for why the PRC government, the People's Republic of China, desires control over the current 14th, since it is through his cooperation that China seeks to legitimize its rule over Tibet. As discussed, the Dalai Lamas have ruled Tibet in an unbroken fashion since the 17th century. This was the case when People's Liberation Army soldiers crossed the border and invaded Tibet in 1949. After the forced signing of the 17-point agreement in 1951, which guaranteed the Tibetan people the right to exercise national autonomy under the communist government, the 14th Dalai Lama briefly collaborated with Chinese communist officials. However, less than 8 years later, and after multiple rebellions against China's land reform policies by Tibetans, the Dalai Lama repudiated the agreement on March 11, 1959. This, according to the 14th, was because China broke all the terms of its own agreement. Following his escape to India, he reinstalled himself as the only legally constituted authority over Tibet and established the Tibetan government in exile in 1959. He slowly began democratizing its structure by gradually devolving his own political powers and through the creation of a national constitution and inauguration of a parliament representing the diverse regions and interests of the Tibetan people. This was the first time in the history of Tibetan governance that average citizens had a say in the internal and external affairs of the Tibetan government. Through this government, the Dalai Lama initiated a new national beginning for the Tibetan people in the Indian subcontinent. Such efforts allowed several 100,000 Tibetans to thrive together despite being refugees. From 1973 onwards, the Dalai Lama began traveling internationally to meet with influential political and spiritual figures to heighten awareness on human rights atrocities taking place in Tibet. His combined effort in cultivating the Tibetan refugee community and generating a political cause for freedom in Tibet became so formidable that Deng Xiaoping, who came to power after Mao Zedong, contacted the Dalai Lama in 1978. Because his activities had created frequent embarrassment for the Chinese government, Deng wanted to persuade the Dalai Lama to, quote, return to the motherland. His return would not only ameliorate the possibility of him becoming potential danger to China in the future, but also would legitimize Chinese rule in Tibet. Aware of what his return would entail, the Dalai Lama began a series of dialogues with the Chinese government to negotiate the terms of his return. He would return if China granted Tibet, which included all three traditional provinces of Kham, Amdo, and Yuuzhan, genuine autonomy. However, after more than 30 years of dialogue, the Chinese government's unwillingness to discuss Tibet's political status and only his return forced the Dalai Lama to bring the dialogue to an end. Since the Chinese government could not persuade the Dalai Lama to return, China retaliated by imposing a complete ban on the Dalai Lama in Tibet. they made it a criminal offense for anyone in Tibet to mention the Dalai Lama by name or own his pictures. Then, in 2007, China's State Administration for Religious Affairs issued a decree that all reincarnations of tulkus of Tibetan Buddhism must get government approval. Otherwise, they will be considered illegal or invalid. This was followed by China's insistence that the Dalai Lama's future reincarnation must comply with Chinese laws and regulations. The implementation of such laws should be seen in light of the fact that China can't impose any kind of control over the current Dalai Lama. This new reincarnation law is an attempt instead to take control of his future. However, in 2011, the 14th Dalai Lama officially resigned from the Tibetan government in exile as its political head. This move ended not only the political rule of the Dalai Lamas within the Tibetan government, but also made the Dalai Lama into a spiritual figure only. He announced that from now on, the affairs of the Dalai Lama, including his future reincarnation, are private matters that only he and his spiritual institution, the Ganden Podrang, have authority over. By transforming himself and the Ganden Podrang into a private, spiritual-only institution, he effectively barred all governments from politicizing and having a say in the private matters of his future. This move effectively countered China's ability to politicize his future reincarnation. I go over the following chronology of events to highlight several things. First, the Chinese government sees the Dalai Lama as an important figure through whom they seek to legitimize their control over Tibet and ameliorate the political issue of Tibet. Second, the Dalai Lama's national and spiritual activities in exile on behalf of Tibet continues to threaten China's legitimacy in Tibet and is the reason why they sought to secure his return through the decades-long Sino-Tibetan dialogue. And third, when the Dalai Lama made clear that he would not return if China is unwilling to grant Tibet genuine autonomy, China responded by creating new reincarnation laws to control his future succession. What becomes clear in the sequence of these events is that the 14th Dalai Lama continues to remain vital for how China plans to legitimize its imperial rise in the world. For these reasons, China continues to see the Dalai Lama both in contempt and as a figure with possible solutions. This serves as the entire rationale for why China wants to control the Dalai Lama's future by creating these new legal and colonial protocols. But how has the 14th Dalai Lama himself responded to these new attempts by China? Aside from insisting that discussions concerning his death are premature, he also responded by assuring Tibetans that he will live well past the age of 100. In a direct challenge, he also stated that no recognition or acceptance should be given to a candidate chosen for political ends by anyone, including in the People's Republic of China. He claimed that whether or not a reincarnation of a Dalai Lama should be recognized was a decision for the Tibetan, Mongolian, and the Himalayan peoples. He stated that he would consult high lamas of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition and his followers to reevaluate whether the institution of the Dalai Lama should continue or not. On that basis, he has said he will make a decision whether to reincarnate. If his followers decide that the institution of the Dalai Lama should continue, then to prepare for what he calls vested political interests misusing the reincarnation system to fulfill their own political agendas, he has said that he will draw clear guidelines to recognize the next Dalai Lama and announce them when he turns 90 next summer. Meanwhile, Tenzin offerings to the 14th Dalai Lama by his followers such as the one recently held in New York and Switzerland, and this one in Dharamsala recently, by his followers have only increased with no signs of slowing down. These long life ritual events are a way for followers to not only show immense gratitude for his contributions, they are also formal ceremonial events for his followers to request the Dalai Lama to live long and to continue being their guide in this and following lifetimes. Tenshuks, in other words, have become formal events where his followers express their wishes for the continuity of the Dalai Lama and his institution directly to the Dalai Lama himself. In 2019, the Tibetan government held a joint event on the Dalai Lama's future reincarnation with high lamas from various Tibetan Buddhist traditions. Together, they released a statement that the decision concerning the way and the manner in which the next reincarnation of the Dalai Lama should appear rests solely within the 14th Dalai Lama. No government or otherwise will have such authority. If the Chinese government chooses a candidate for the Dalai Lama, the Tibetan people will not recognize and respect that candidate. The statement reiterates the 14th Dalai Lama's own stance on his future succession and showcases that the Tibetan government and religious hierarchs of Tibetan Buddhism backs the wishes of the current Dalai Lama. Yet, there has been growing interest from different parties in the Dalai Lama's future succession, including by Western academics who secured a big grant for this conference. Concerns surrounding who these people are, why they are interested in the Dalai Lama's future succession, and the grant money they received because of the topic were raised by Tibetan parliamentarians in the Tibetan government. The negative reaction highlights Tibetan concerns about outsiders who are attempting to insert themselves in what Tibetans view as the private matters of the current Dalai Lama. This reaction not only extends to outsiders, but includes Tibetans as well. There has been a steady rise in a number of Tibetan public figures, including former politicians. This one is Lobsang Sangye, the former Sikyong of the Tibetan government, who have written op-eds on the subject of the Dalai Lama's future reincarnation on different news platforms. I don't like the way they are talking about the succession, said an Amchi friend in Dharamsala recently. Amchi is a Tibetan doctor. What business is it of theirs, he emphasized. In another conversation with a friend's mother, she highlighted with disappointment how young, aspiring public figures in the Tibetan community in Dharamsala have been pushing the agenda of Madhidrupu as if they should have a say in the matter. When a few people in Gyeonggi, which is the seat of the Tibetan government, learned that I was planning to present at the same conference that Western academics received grants for, they advised me to pull out, citing concerns how it feels as though everyone is making opportunity out of the Dalai Lama's future succession. Their concerns were not so much that these people were talking about the Dalai Lama, but that they were being opportunistic, talking about a sacred figure they hold near and dear. To best capture how Tibetans feel on the matter, I turn to statements by Thupten Wondrup, the oracle medium of Nichung, who will play one of the more important roles in determining and figuring out the next Dalai Lama. In 2020, in response to a journalist who asked him about the Dalai Lama's future succession, he said traditionally it is taboo to speak on the reincarnation of a Lama who is still alive. But because of the Chinese government's pressure, the world is eager to know that if the Dalai Lama decides to come back to the Tibetan people by reincarnating, he would do so in a place with freedom and continue with the work the 14th Dalai Lama has already begun. This stance reinforces and reiterates what the 14th Dalai Lama himself has said on the matter. It is very clear that the Tibetan people unanimously back whatever decision the Dalai Lama chooses to make. So, how should we as scholars proceed in regards to how we engage this pressing topic? I suggest we wait for the 14th Dalai Lama's statement when he turns 60 next year. In the meantime, I suggest we pay close attention to responses by Tibetans on how this topic is being engaged. Their responses and critiques can act as guides for how we approach this topic ethically and responsibly. As scholars, we are in the business of shaping discourse, and the discourse concerning Dalai Lama and his future reincarnation concerns the futures of not only the Dalai Lama, but also the Tibetan people. This interchangeable bond between the two is what's repeatedly stressed during these Denshuk ceremonies, with the Tibetan people and the Dalai Lama affirming their undeniable karmic ties with one another. As such, it becomes essential that we center the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan people when we engage this important but sensitive topic, since it is them who stands to gain or lose the most from our discursive engagements as scholars. Thank you.
God, Andrew, I'm gonna invite you to.
Here or?
Yeah.
I guess so, yeah. just-
Here is fine.
Well, maybe stand up so people
Sure.
hear you.
Should I use the mic or?
I guess use the mic.
Yeah.
Is the mic even working?
I hope this mic is working.
Oh.
It's not working, right? But it feels good to hold it like this. So I'm gonna hold it like this, pretend it works. Thank you, Dawa. Thank you, Dr. Lokyitsang, for the presentation. I have a couple of questions, right? So one question is kind of like strategic, related to Tibetan side of the strategy, right? So there were discussions about in your historical kind of outline, you mentioned how Chinese government has been trying to bring the Dalai Lama back home so that they can exploit his name, his institution, right? And from His Holiness's side, he has also expressed a lot of times, many times, his desire to go back to Tibet. He also expressed his desire to actually go to China for a visit, right? And those are two separate things. But it seems like if China really wants to bring His Holiness to Tibet or to China to kind of like close the chapter on the Tibet issue, it seems like they do have an opportunity to achieve something like that. And if they were able to bring him back, it might also serve their cause in the future to actually control his reincarnation, the 15th. It might give them a better chance at achieving that. His Holiness from his side has actually stated, not even necessarily the demand of wanting to return to Tibet, but even the lower kind of request of just wanting to visit China and visit the Wutaishan mountain. There is a connection with Manjushri, you know. So it seems like if that desire is there on both sides, it seems like there is some overlap in the desires. And one question that comes up is why hasn't that happened if both sides seem to want it, right? That's one. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts and analysis about why that has not happened. The other question I have is related to your conclusion, because you come down on the side of the idea that it's premature to talk about so much of these questions and the issues surrounding the succession of His Holiness. And I think you make some important arguments backing that point, right? And I think, yeah, the arguments you make related to the importance of centering Tibetan tradition, the Tibetan actors and the players, especially, of course, His Holiness at the center of all of this, and Tibetan political leadership all of that, and the religious authorities and the leadership. That makes a lot of sense to me. At the same time, the reality is that this issue is no longer just a purely religious matter. It is no longer just a purely spiritual, personal matter of His Holiness. It has already become political. It has already become politicized by the Chinese government. And in a scenario or a situation where one side has already politicized the issue and turned it into a game of chess, in a game of real political chess, in that, once that has already happened, it's almost like the cat is out of the bag. And if our side, if the Tibetan side is slow to get to this important conversation, slow to discuss the problem and the solutions that we might be able to find, if we are late to the party, what kind of opportunities might we miss? And also, what is to be lost? Do we end up losing more than we gain? Is it kind of like, would we be, if we followed this, would we be making the same mistakes that we made in 1950 and 1951, where Lhasa was kind of like pretending that we could still ignore once the war has already started, trying to stop the war even though the war has already begun? Would we be making that mistake again? Because I see a strong argument on the side of, actually, since China has already politicized this, if we are silent about this, then China will fill the vacuum. They will fill the void, and they will fill the internet. They will make all the noise and messaging about this. Yeah. And I'll conclude with a question. So from our side, should we also not be countering Chinese message with our messaging, Tibetan messaging? Thank you.
Thank you. Since this is no use, I'm just gonna yell. So the first part of the question about the dialogue, the reason why I went over the chronology is to highlight the Dalai Lama's political agency. The fact that he knows that China desires the return of the Dalai Lama in order to legitimize its presence in Tibet. Tibet continues to be a thorn in China's imperial image in the world. So I'm trying to highlight how the Dalai Lama knows this. And he's like, okay, you want me to return? Well, I have some demands, right? And so I wanted to highlight how savvy he has been in negotiating the terms of his return. He's like, okay, if you want me to return and legitimize your presence in Tibet, then I have some demands. And my demands are that you guys actually give Tibet actual genuine autonomy, which was highlighted under the 17th point agreement, like self-rule, self-determination, letting the Tibetan people, for example, have the right and access to their own language, which is currently under attack right now. So Tibetan children no longer have access to learning Tibetan in school. They want to accelerate assimilation policies that we have seen in this country, especially with the First Nation. So the dialogues, the primary reason why it ended, like I have said, is China is not willing to negotiate the political status of Tibet. It's only interested in the return of the Dalai Lama. And he has said, if you're not going to abide by the conditions of my return, I'm not going to come and help you legitimize your control over Tibet. So this was to highlight how he has been negotiating the term of his own return, right, with China, by trying to negotiate a situation for Tibet that is favorable to the Tibetan people. The second question, I'm not saying that we're being premature. It's the Dalai Lama who's saying that we're being premature. He's saying he is still alive and he can make that statement himself. I don't think we're being too late or we're not acting fast enough. I also think that we as researchers need to be able to see how our subjects are engaging with this topic. One of the things I'm trying to highlight is not only the Dalai Lama, but the Tibetan people. And what I've said is Tenshuks have become the official way. One of the conditions that he said He said the continuation of the institution of the Dalai Lama will depend on the wishes of the Tibetan, Mongolian, and Himalayan people. Denshoks have not just been offerings of gratitude, they have been official requests. So we're not even seeing as researchers that these people are making those formal requests. So I'm just saying that scholars need to be paying closer attention if they want to see what the Tibetan people are actually doing, right? So those are one of the things I wanted to highlight. So the Tibetan people, like one of the things was, if you guys want me to come back, let me know, and that's what Denshoks have been. And as far as the Dalai Lama's future is concerned, 1 year is not too far to wait. The Dalai Lama himself has said when he turns 90, he will discuss the matters of his future reincarnation. At this moment, I think the Tibetan people have spoken, asking him to return to them through these long life ritual ceremonial events. I think 1 year isn't that far off. I think we as scholars need to be patient and pay attention to not only waiting for His Holiness, but like I said, we haven't really been that great at seeing what the Tibetan people themselves have been asking for. We can draw up surveys, but I think these Denshuk ceremonies are culturally and religiously appropriate ways in which they've been doing so. And the fact that there's been so, like the one in New York was over 17,000 people that showed up. These are very clear signs that they want him to come back. And these are ways in which that they're doing it. So I'm just asking scholars to kind of basically, instead of, I think like China's in a rush. And what Nechung points out is that like, even though he's still here, we're in a rush to try and determine what he's going to do next, or like suggest what he should do next. And he makes it clear that this rush is entirely driven by the Chinese government. And I'm asking scholars to pause a second and not follow in the lead of the Chinese government, right? We can be patient. And in the meantime, I think we can do better research when it comes to how the Tibetan people have been responding. And they have already been responding since his resignation in 2011. Denshoks have increased. So, they've been happening for a while. So yeah, that's my response to that.
Where's Nicole? Nicole,
You get to follow that.
yeah.
Dawa. Okay. Asking a question in this context is really is incredibly difficult, I think, actually. But I will, because I love the dialogue and I love your courageousness and your ability to really bring up hard issues. And so I think there's a tension here, right? Between, and I think as an anthropologist and other anthropologists, I'm not an anthropologist, but as a religious studies scholar, I have been very much informed by anthropology. And I think one of the key terms that, I can't remember who coined it, don't ask me, but that emic versus etic perspective, right? That insider versus outsider perspective. And one of the things I think in religious studies that we benefit most from is when we actually have a true dialogue between that emic and etic perspective, because it's through that kind of interaction between both practitioners who, offer their inside perspective, what it is like to do practice, what it is like to be at a Tenshok ceremony and to feel that sort of connectedness and that touchstone with His Holiness, right? And then at the same time, it's scholars' responsibility to say, hey, this is going on in the geopolitical world. And I'm a China scholar, and I think there's not enough being done on real scholarship on China on this issue. And I totally think in that way, we are being premature in some ways, because that's the kind of scholarship that really needs to be done. Like, we really need scholars who actually speak and read Chinese well enough to deal with the kind of level of subtlety and discourse and signs on what the position is on the Dalai Lama issue, but also China, geopolitically. As you said, you said it beautifully, the imperial image that Xi Jinping is trying to create and is being debunked. So my question for you is, you're a scholar. So where do you see your responsibility in shaping this discourse?
Well, I mean, this presentation was my response. But I did not want to follow the Chinese government's lead. They are pushing us in this frenzy to be the first to kind of, what is the Dalai Lama going to do? What is he possibly going to do? What should he do? I think instead, not enough attention is being paid to China and how China is preparing. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you guys didn't know that China created these laws. It's not common knowledge. The Dalai Lama is common knowledge, and everybody's curious about what he's going to do next about his reincarnation. But there's no attention being paid to China. And as scholars, I think we can do a better job at articulating how China is mobilizing and has been mobilizing for a long time. And we have not done a good job highlighting that, historicizing that, and showcasing how they're systemizing a religious reincarnation system, right? I also think as scholars, we're not also seeing the sophistication of the Dalai Lama. His resignation in 2011 was a response to what China's attempting to do. By transforming himself into a spiritual only figure and his institution into a spiritual only institution, he's not just doing things symbolically. He's saying no governments have any authority over my private matters. These are specific legal moves that he's countering the Chinese government with. And when we can't see him as the sophisticated figure that he is, making these like legal and like political moves, we don't see how it's countering China. So as much as we want to highlight how sophisticated China is becoming, we also need to highlight how he is just as sophisticated, if not more, because he has been in this entire time. That's the primary reason why they want to control him, because they can't.
Like Cameron Warner, our last respondent.
Hi, Dawa. I'm Cameron. I was the Facebook post in the presentation. So I'll say a few words about that, and it'll lead to a question. I'll get there as soon as I can. So I disagree with the premise that anybody is rushing to anything, because I think of the succession as a process. It's not a moment in time, and it's a process that started a long time back. It started with, in 2011, the Dalai Lama coming up with a website saying, these are the ways that my succession process might play out. That was when this started, in 2011. And nobody in academia paid any attention. Nobody did any research of any kind. Years went by. Then all of the high lamas got together and they discussed it. They came out with a resolution. Nobody in academia said anything about it, didn't pay any attention. Then the Tibetan government in exile looked at this and they said, we have a resolution too. And they came out with it. None of us paid any attention. Then the Himalayan people all across the Himalayas got together and they came out with a resolution. None of us paid any attention to it. While this was going on, I was doing field work in Dharamsala with members of the CTA, and they were talking to me about the succession privately, and they were saying, why is it nobody is paying any attention? Why are no scholars doing anything about this? And they said, we really want you specifically to study tulkus and reincarnation. We want you to have conferences and papers on this. But I thought, well, I don't know about that. I didn't do anything at first. So these things were going on. The US government passed a series of resolutions in Congress in favor of whatever the Dalai Lama decides. But as scholars, do we say anything about it, study it? No. So the process was going on for years, and all these things were happening. And then His Holiness said, I'm going to have an announcement when I turn 90 years old. Now, we've learned in the conference the last couple of days that that's not as exact as we thought it was. But it gave the world this impression he's put a date in the calendar. So that then, not the Chinese, all those other things created this pressure like, wow, there's going to be something that happens on this date and we should all be ready and prepared. So as academics, what are the first thing that we do? The first thing we do is find other academics to talk about it and say, what do we not know and what should we try to learn? So that's how this happened. And this leads to the question. in the statement that you had earlier from His Holiness, he said the Tibetans, the Mongolians, and the Himalayan people. But here in your final slide, you only refer to the Tibetans. And I bring this up because I've been doing field work in Tibet, in northern India, but also especially Nepal since 1998. And if you were to go to the Himalayan region outside of Tibet, before the Dalai Lama came to exile, you would not find a throne reserved for the 13th Dalai Lama. You would not find images of him in the monasteries. Nobody was celebrating his birthday. He wasn't a figure of importance or devotion for a lot of the Himalayan region, only in a few places. But now most of the Himalayan region, most of the monasteries and nunneries, most of the communities, they see the Dalai Lama also as their kind of a leader. And that's not something that they got to on their own. The Dalai Lama has drawn them towards himself through his great actions. But the complicating factor of him as both a national leader of a particular group of people and a religious leader of which anyone can join in creates this kind of awkward at times, not so easy relationship. So that's the question then is, what do you see from your point of view as an anthropologist doing fieldwork on this topic of what kind of relationship should those other Himalayan people have to this process, and how can they participate, or how can they support, or where do they belong? Thank you.
Thank you. In regards to the first part of the question, it would be interesting to see if CTA officials can confirm that, you guys were like in a hurry to figure out if scholars would talk about it. What I think is interesting, and what I keep highlighting more and more, is the people who responded first were the Tibetans. They have been since 2011, and through the main medium of Denshoks, where they keep repeatedly asking him to come back to them, right? So these are culturally and spiritual specific ways of formally asking this figure to come back to them. Whether we like to see it or not is up to us, and that's about our ways of seeing our research subject, right? And so, but in regards to the concerns of these people, like I'm gonna read back what they said. Their concerns were not so much about these people, so much that these people were talking about the Dalai Lama, but that they were being opportunistic, talking about the sacred figure they hold near and dear. And I think this is a critique, not of the scholars, but it's a critique that we should be paying attention to. It's a concern because this is an important figure to them. He is relevant to their everyday life and the structure of the entire exile community and the Tibetan community inside. So he is an important figure that they don't like being meddled around with. And it's a critique that I think we should be mindful of, right? It's not an accusation, but it is a critique that we should pay attention to. And the reason why I say the Tibetan people, it's gonna impact the future of the Tibetan people, is because the Dalai Lama is intimately tied, as I've said before, to the development of Tibet as a sovereign nation since the 17th century. They are part and parcel of Tibet as an empire, and then following that as a nation. And the 14th Dalai Lama in particular, for creating a thriving Tibetan community and the political cause that the Tibetan people have. It's the reason why all of you guys know the phrase Free Tibet, right? So because of such activities, Tibetans are intimately linked with him. As far as the Mongolian and the Himalayan communities are concerned, this Tenshuk offering was by the Monyul people. These are the Memba people. And this is Arunachal Pradesh. They're on the border of Tibet on the India side. China is currently claiming Monyul territories as southern Tibet, and therefore geographically, technically China. So making claims over these territories. So these are absolutely political claims. And as a return, they make both political and spiritual claims over the Dalai Lamas. Also, the 6th Dalai Lama was a Monpa. So they come from among these groups of people. And if you go through Tibetan imperial history, they at once used to be under the Tibetan government and under the Ganden Phodrang government rule. So I don't think you can necessarily separate the politics and the spiritual in terms of these people's relationship with the Dalai Lama, the present Dalai Lama. And the other thing that I remember is when the controversy of the Dalai Lama and the Indian boy happened in 2023, one of the communities that came up the most forceful was the Himalayan communities in India. They were extremely outraged by the kind of footage and the kind of salacious attack on his character. And I remember people in Ladakh, in the process of saying how dare you guys cover our spiritual leader this way and do miscoverage over him, they also accused the Chinese government of playing a role in the creation of misinformation online, as far as Twitter and YouTube and Instagram is considered. As we know, China has played a role in our elections as far as misinformation is considered. So I think it's interesting. Tibetan communities have not asked Himalayan people to be politically involved. What I think is interesting about these Himalayan people's devotion and ties to the Dalai Lama is, number one, they call out previous relationships with the Dalai Lama. And number two, they become political when the Dalai Lama's image and actual position is being threatened. And they are willing to call China out. And these are not requests made by Tibetans. These are Himalayan communities asserting themselves.
That was a good letter. I said, Bernice.
Yeah.
People on Zoom,
That's good.
turn off your mic.
Okay, we can now open to questions from the audience. Do you want to just comment on yourself?
I have a question about, it seems to me that we've already seen a flagrant example of China manipulating a reincarnation in the Karmapa. And also some of the political shenanigans amongst Tibetans and Tibetan leaders with regard to that reincarnation process. So I'm wondering how you see that historical event influencing this one or setting up precedent.
I mean, I think the good thing about that scenario is, so the Karmapa is one, the Panchen Lama is the other one. After the last Panchen Lama passed away in Tibet under mysterious circumstances, his reincarnation was found. And as soon as his reincarnation was recognized, the Chinese government disappeared him and his family. He was at the time, I think, age 6. And then installed their own Panchen Lama. And what's interesting about him is even though the Chinese government wants to legitimize him as the official Panchen Lama, the Tibetan people do not see him as the real Panchen Lama, both inside and outside. So I think the sad part about that is we don't know what happened to the one that was recognized. Him and his family are still missing. And the Tibetan people are still demanding answers from the Chinese government. But I think the good thing about that is those of us outside in the international community are aware that China has been up to no good for a while. So if anything, if and when the Chinese government wants to install their own Dalai Lama, at least we will be aware that this is an old tactic.
So the Royal Grand House in Sakya was here recently, Colorado, Holiness Chichen, which is his 80th birthday, and with him his son, the 42nd, 41st, 42nd, and 43rd, all holiness, all enthroned, all empowered, all their job. And it impressed me how there's not going to be any question for a long time on who and of course they're paternal lineage, but it does press the question of whether reincarnation is really the wise way forward, given how complicated all the things And that if it ever were to change, I know this is almost sacrilegious, but if it were ever to change, it would be His Holiness the Dalai Lama who would have to do it if it was going to be genuine. Does that come into the conversation at all?
I mean, that was one of the things that I was highlighting that some people were suggesting. I mean, he himself has outlined several different ways in which his emanation and reincarnation could possibly take place. And I think the reason why he's talked about that is to make his audience aware that there are heterogeneous ways of like he's trying to make the audience aware that there's multiple ways in which reincarnation and emanation can take place, because these are esoteric practices. But I think ultimately, whether it's reincarnation or emanation, it's going to be him who's going to decide it, because ultimately it will be his word that will be that will legitimize whatever system, whether it's the old system or a new system that takes place. But I'm saying at the end of the day, it's the Dalai Lama who lends the system any legitimacy.
Pardon my ignorance, I'm an engineering professor and not a religious scholar. The original sin seems to be going against the edicts of Buddha or Christ or many other religious leaders said. The kingdom I'm talking about is not of this world. And don't conflate the two, the political power and the religious scholarship. Okay? So the fifth Dalai Lama has possibly, if I heard you understood you correctly, has made the original sin of combining the two powers. Why are we not focusing on spiritual or religious power or teacher to be purely spiritual and not political? And this whole issue of whether China rules today or some Rome rules the Christian world, or all the things are not of the truly religious matter.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's hard to talk about a history that has already happened. So I can't speak for the fifth Dalai Lama, but he has been foundational in establishing Tibet as a nation. But what is interesting about the 14th is by resigning in 2011, he made it impossible for him and future Dalai Lamas to be political. And so he transformed himself and the institution into a spiritual only institution. And it was in the interest of the continuity of not only himself and his institution, but of the Tibetan people. So in its place, he created an independent Tibetan government to lead the Tibetan people without him. And so I think that's what's more interesting about this. I think you had a question?
Yes, so you touched on it a little bit with talking about the pension Lama and everything that has happened around there. But my question is kind of, a lot of this is focused on the conversation around the diaspora, which, naturally given the Dalai Lama's holiness position relative to the diaspora. And I do understand, of course, this is somewhat of a difficult topic, especially about Tibetans in Tibet, because of how they've systemically been denied a voice, been displaced, even in literally their language, right? And of course, since the Dalai Lama's images and discussion of them has been examined. But I guess my question is, what is this discussion insofar as it's able to happen? What does this look like within Tibet itself, and not within, or not necessarily just within the diaspora? I know, again, our information is probably quite limited, but I was just been wondering this throughout this whole conversation.
Well, aside from creating new laws to control the religious reincarnation of all Tibetan Buddhist teachers, traditionally what happens is each Lama they have their own institution. The Dalai Lama's institution is the Ganden Pojang, which is responsible for the religious reincarnation protocols of finding the next Dalai Lama. Same with all of the other tukus. What has happened with the creation of law, this new law, is they have homogenized it and said, none of your institution are in control. It's us now. You have to ask us if you're legitimate. And only with our approval will you get to be legitimate. So number one, they've created a series of laws to design themselves to be the authority, right? And take the authority away from these lamas and their institution. And then the second thing that they're doing is prepping. So from a friend from Tibet, I heard that they keep, so like not long ago, they spread news, the state official news in like one county of Tibet that the Dalai Lama had died. And went to the monasteries to monitor who's going to come do death rituals and prayers in order to monitor the people who might, and then as a way to preemptively arrest them, but also to discourage, if and when that moment happens, right, that they are not to be doing these things. So they're already conditioning them.
How can they have a voice? You know? So I think it's not a question at all. But when I was about 9 years old, in 1959, the Dalai Lama came to Missouri, which is where we spent our summers. And he was living at the house of a woman who was my grandmother's friend. And my grandmother took me to see the Dalai Lama. At 9 years old, maybe I was not even aware of what I was doing, but I'm really glad she did. And he was such a striking presence that I remember him, the way he looked then. Now, he had a radiance on his face, which no one can. Once you see him, I will be there. So I was fortunate to have seen him.
Thank you.
Sean, interested to know if you want to play at 5:15
Hi,
today.
Guy. We hear you on Zoom. If you can like mute yourself.
It's, I personally am like this. First of all, I would like to acknowledge and thank you for this lecture regarding having the sense of urgency there is for us Tibetan Dalai Lama followers to have the right freedom to have a say in which how to go about the procedure. My question to you is, knowing the fact that there's always two sides on, actually, my question to you is, how can you use the medium of modern scholastic research to bridge the sort of aura of divide that is amongst his followers who have the freedom. Within China, as we all know, there is no freedom to keep it saying. How can modern scholastic research create a space where Tibetans and non-Tibetans, religious and non-religious, anybody and everybody who are utterly interested in legitimizing the religious and the Buddhist way of reincarnation?
And I think some of this I already kind of talked about. I think one of the things that we could be doing as scholars is actually paying attention to China. What China's doing is these are new colonial laws as a way to control charismatic figures of indigenous communities. This is not the first time colonial imperial powers have done this. The British have known to have done this in Africa. So we could be learning, and also in India. So we could be learning from these moves to highlight what China's doing, you know? And the other thing, I mean, I can speak as an anthropologist, and as anthropologists, we are bound to ethical kinds of research. And one of the ways that we can do that is to actually spend time with the people with whom this issue is extremely important. They deserve the time and the energy. We need to be listening to them, and we need to be paying attention to what they themselves are saying, and highlighting like what's important to them. So this is why I ended with, we need to be centering the Dalai Lama. Number one, the fact that he's been extremely savvy and doing things for a while, not just sitting there idly by, right? And then the other thing that we could be paying attention to is Tibetans have been responding. And, you know, we need to be seeing this and we need to be covering it, right? And so I think we need to be really careful that we sent, careful to center Tibetans and His Holiness on how this like process is spanning out and what it actually means, you know, including understanding his resignation as a move in the interest of the Tibetan people and himself. He ended his own political rule and other future Dalai Lama's possibility of ever ruling. And instead, Tibetans say we've been gifted a democratic government, right? And it is in the interest of our continuity. So I would say we need to be paying attention to this and recognize that and use that as analysis for how we talk about the present situation. Anyone else? Any Tibetan? Oh, sorry.
If it is Tibetan name ones.
Okay.
But my question is, the way that you presented it made it seem how strategic it was that he didn't ask for independence, that he was asking for what he was asking for. I know that 25 years ago that he was really upset, like that he wanted independence, he wanted really angry. So I'm wondering now that, you know, for I mean, what people see the strategy involved, or is there still a lot of anger over independence versus?
Well, that's a loaded question. I mean, right now, the concern is the Dalai Lama's future succession because China keeps trying to control it. And that's the insecure, that's generating a lot of anxiety for the Tibetan people, both inside and outside. And as far as the political situation is concerned, I think Tibetans can ask whether it's for genuine autonomy or independence all we want, but ultimately China has to be playing a role in that conversation, and they're unwilling to have any conversation on this issue. It's the exact reason why the Dalai Lama shut down the dialogue process and refused to return. But I think what's important to pay attention to is China is currently under Xi Jinping. What I've noticed is, I mean, China study scholars are paying attention. I'm not sure if others are catching up, but China is slowly taking away all of its proposed autonomy rights that Tibetan people supposedly have. They are silently taking away all of these, whether it's right to language, access to religious practice. They're rolling back on a lot of this, and it's starting to be reminiscent of Cultural Revolution policies.
As academics, do you have more freedom to speak about it? Is there more freedom to?
We have the freedom to talk about it. They can't talk about it inside. Yeah. I think the academic community, like the Tibetan activist community have been doing their work as far as highlighting these violations. I don't think necessarily the academic discourse has caught on to the fact that these are structural policies, not just human rights issues. For a long time, the activist community has framed it as human rights violations. They're absolutely human rights violations. But I don't think the academic community has quite caught up to the fact that these are existent laws now being taken away to accelerate assimilation. So there's not enough research being done on this, not enough attention, but there is a slow progression. And so that's encouraging.
Thank you so much for the important, respectful, and working discussion. So you mentioned, and kind of I'm piggybacking on what Cameron said earlier about the Himalayan communities and the connections, spiritual connection that they have with the Dalai Lama. And I think, yeah. So I also kind of thinking back about Tibetan communities that are also living refugees who are in the Himalayan societies. Not only I guess, is there a spiritual connection on the higher level with the Dalai Lama, but then there are so many cultural institutions that are built over the past 6 decades. And these cultural institutions have actually played an important role in reviving a lot of Himalayan cultural institutions,
well. So in a way, in exile, we are not just simply dependent on the host state, we have contributed a lot. And right now, we are talking about the moment in the future when things are going to get difficult, right? Both for Tibetans inside and outside, and especially in India, because you're technically stateless, unless and until you take on citizenship, and now which is becoming more common. There's that kind of precarity that exists. So my question to you is, what are the opportunities for the Himalayan communities to show up for the Tibetans, especially after that difficult moment? And especially things that we can prepare right now, in terms of both, not necessarily at a national level, but at a state level, at a local level. In Ladakh, for instance, there is no local policy. Okay, so there's local policy, there's no written local policy about how you're going to secure freedom for the Tibetans in the area.
Thank you for that, and for highlighting how in many ways the institutions that the Dalai Lama created has actually contributed also to the thrivance of Himalayan cultural institutions and communities. My main dissertation research is actually on the creation of Tibetan boarding schools in India. And not only has it graduated over 4 generations of Tibetan students, it has also graduated several generations of Himalayan students who are Nepali and Indian citizens. And also I used to work for a conservancy for Tibetan arts and culture, which basically helped communities in Mustang, like in rural parts of Nepal and India, Tibetan Buddhist communities, ethnically Buddhist Tibetan communities, rebuild old monasteries and the creation of schools in these areas themselves. So in many ways, His Holiness's, the Dalai Lama's efforts have not only impacted Tibetans in a positive way, but also the Himalayan communities. And this is something that they acknowledge. Not only their long-standing historical kinship ties with the Dalai Lamas, but also acknowledging being on the receiving end of his blessings, essentially. And so I thought what was interesting was when the controversy on the Dalai Lama broke in India, the first communities to get extremely angry and respond was the community in Tawang and the Ladakhi community. They came out in full force and let the Indian media know that he was not someone to be playing with, right? And so I do think that the Himalayan community acknowledges that. And what I've also noticed is, I don't know about official organizations, but I do know individual Ladakhis, for example, who have become much more politically active in trying to understand what's going on with China and Tibet, especially in light to what is happening on the border. I mean, there's been a lot of Chinese military border agitations in Tawang, where Menpa people are, and in Ladakh. So they are extremely aware of China's geographic and imperial agitations at the border, and they're at the receiving end of it. So in many ways, Himalayan communities have rights that Tibetan refugees don't have access to. And there is a growing consciousness to be politically active, because the political issue of Tibet is intimately tied to what's going on as far as military incursions on their borders. And in many ways, China is using Tibetan history to claim these borders. And so these Himalayan communities are asserting themselves in political ways. So in that sense, I think there could be alliances made. And I do think that the Himalayan communities are aware that they have certain kinds of rights that they can totally activate. And it would be nice to see more of this kind of activity taking place. And I think it's in development.
I think now is the time for us all to say thank you to Dawa and get her upstairs to drink and eat. And